Okay, we'll get started. So from now on, from this class forward, this is the material that will be on the final exam. So your exam is on Saturday. It will cover chapters 1 through 6 and lectures 1 through 9 up until last Wednesday's lecture. So that's that. So this material you certainly will need to know because it will be on the final. The midterm location, I put it up on WebCT. So this is where you'll be writing your exam. It's by last name. So Section A versus Section T. Some of you will go in, at least it's all around the same area. So if you can find Azarelli Theater, that's good. Then you can try, there'll be notices up so you can find which room you are in Azarelli Theater. There's a small group of you writing in Torrey, which is nearby. Okay? So this is up on WebCT as an announcement. I will put these slides up after class today so you can go back and check. So the exam is from 9 until noon. It's a 3-hour exam. Should be plenty of time for you to do the 70 multiple choice questions. Someone just came up and asked me whether or not the midterm is going to be similar to what was on the quiz. Okay, so the quiz that most of you did, quiz 1, yes, those quiz items were taken directly from the test bank, so it will be similar. Okay? Today we're going to go through assignment 3. For those of you who did assignment 3, from now on, I'm going to incorporate your responses from the assignments into the lecture. So I'll give you feedback. Some people have been asking, well, what about feedback on the assignments? I will now incorporate your assignment into the lecture, and today I'm going to talk about assignment 3. I'll talk about function of juries, characteristics of juries, jury selection methods, and research with juries. Yeah, you have a question?
Yeah, actually, for the test bank.
Okay, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, you know your study guide? That's
Okay.
something similar to the test bank?
Okay, the question is, you know, the study guide, is it similar to the test bank?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So if you have the study guide, and you go through those multiple choice questions at the end, and you get 100% each time, close, okay, even 80%, I'm predicting you'll do very well on the final. I'm on the midterm. Now, I looked over the midterm. We're photocopying it right now, and it is kind of challenging, which is maybe not what you wanted to hear. There's some really easy questions, and there's about, I'd say, 10 or 12 really challenging questions. But what we will be doing, as I mentioned on Wednesday when I mentioned the review session tomorrow, the TA is holding a review session tomorrow. Okay, so the TA is holding a review session tomorrow from 9 to 11, 2 hours. You could, I don't know, you go through multiple choice questions with her. You can ask her any questions about chapters 1 through 6. She knows what's on the midterm. I don't know, you can ask her questions and watch her eyes and see whether she looks up or down. I don't know, whatever you want. Anyway, from 9 to 11, Loeb D70, 780. Okay, it was on, I put that up last Wednesday. Okay, so in Loeb D780, Heather will be running a review session. Now what happened on Wednesday when I mentioned this, many people said, well, that's fine and good, but I can't make it to that review session. Okay, so what I will do, I have chapter 7 to cover. I will be starting today. I have, I don't remember, about 48 slides to go through. So as soon as I finish those slides, it won't be today, but on Wednesday, I will do a review session as well on Wednesday in class. Okay, but that's not going to be 2 hours, obviously. It's going to be more like 45 minutes, 50 minutes, or an hour. Okay, and there's no way I'm going to review 9 lectures in 45 minutes, so you should come with questions. I will come with sample multiple choice items that we can work through, but if you have particular areas that you're unsure of or is not clear, I'll make the assumption that you've already read chapters 1 through 6 and studied by Wednesday, because your exam is on Saturday. Hopefully it's a good... I know I used to cram the night before, but that's not the best way of doing it. So what I'm suggesting is that you start studying now for Saturday. I know you have a whole bunch of other midterms, but, you know, try to spend a few minutes, an hour or two studying. Okay, is that all okay? We're ready for the midterm? Are we ready for the midterm? No. Okay, well, Wednesday, hopefully you'll be ready. Okay, assignment 3. Now, not all of you wrote assignment 3. Well, maybe you're the keeners in class here, so maybe all of you did. But anyway, assignment 3 was where you read a case scenario, right? You either got case number 1 or case number 2. Okay, and you read about Mr. Hattori, the Japanese tourist in town, had gone off to a movie, gone to a bank machine, withdrew money, got mugged, robbed at knife point, got his wallet, his keys, and his car rental stolen. He remembered the robber was Caucasian. He remembered the guy had a knife when he got robbed. There was no other witnesses. The bank camera didn't capture any of this information. He was then brought to the police station where he gave an immediate description of the perpetrator. So everything was the same up to there. For those who got case 1, he was then asked to come back to the police station 2 weeks later. Okay, I know some of you have done this a long time ago, but 2 weeks later he came back and he was confident, I think the word was certain, he was certain that he picked out the correct person from a simultaneous lineup. Okay, does that all ring a bell? Good. And there was no mention of him being hypnotized. For those of you who got case number 2, everything was the same. He gave the immediate description, except that he was hypnotized. You got him hypnotized. Or someone did. Hypnotized, and then he was called back 4 months later. Okay? So that was the only manipulation. And in some of the other assignments to come, I will do the same thing. Some of you will get one case, some will get a modification of the case, so we can look at differences. Okay, so how confident are you, this was the first question, that the man Mr. Hattori identified is actually the man that robbed him? Okay, so these are your responses. So you can see it does span, not at all, somewhat vary. So for case 1, where it was immediate, 2 week, well, not immediate description, and then a 2-week time delay, you were giving more somewhat than not at all or very. Okay, so you thought, 60% of you felt that this eyewitness would be somewhat confident that you thought Mr. Hattori identified him. For case 2, where there was Hattori was hypnotized, you can see there's a slight shift. More of you are not at all confident, probably due to the fact of either the time delay or him being hypnotized, than somewhat. Okay? But certainly there was a range. So some of you, in both cases less than 10%, were very confident. Right? You trusted his eyewitness account. Okay, I'm not, certainly this is not unusual that people will range in how much emphasis they'll put on an eyewitness statement. Okay, so that was just a simple question. You had a 3-point scale. Then I asked you, explain why you were confident or not confident in the accuracy of Mr. Hattori's identification. Okay, so why did you give that rating? So can anyone remember what they wrote? Yeah?
I wrote that I couldn't be too certain that he was giving an accurate description because, for instance, it was dark. We don't know how much lighting was in the parking lot.
Okay.
Also, he was hypnotized, so I think there was one of the slides that actually said the accuracy
good. Okay.
Just to that extent, and because of the 4-month delay, and because of the type of lineup that was used.
Okay. She's got all the answers. Good. This is good. Keep going.
He was asked, I think it was, I can't remember the specific name of the lineup, but he had to compare faces. So he was, the recall was on memory as opposed to being shown one photograph and asked to try to remember if this was the same individual. So it was like, I don't know, it was all over the place.
Okay, so she wasn't so sure because of contextual factors. It was dark, the lag time, the hypnosis, and the type of lineup used. And yeah.
Yeah, I got number 2. I got down very confident that I actually ignored the fact that it was hypnotized. That didn't even.
You ignored the fact that what?
I ignored the fact that it was hypnotized.
Okay.
Because I don't have any cases about hypnosis.
Okay.
But that night that we got jacked up,
Mm-hmm.
okay, when you go through traumatic experience, one or two things happen. Sometimes time can seem to slow down, and you can actually become very aware of what's around you, and you can actually take really detailed perceptions of the people, and especially if you have like a knife in front of you, you really can focus on what's going on. Or you go through a state of paranoia, in which case it's all blur.
Right. Okay.
So he gave a detail. So in the example that he gave, when he first went to the police station, he gave a detailed account of the person. Regardless of whether it's like dark or not, but then the guy's got a knife on you. He's up close to you.
Okay. So okay, this guy is convinced this guy did a good eyewitness job. Yeah. Okay, so that you got someone, I don't think I can summarize all of what you said, but let me try quickly. So you've got someone who approaches you with a knife, who's asking for your wallet, the keys to your car. You're going to be paying attention. You're going to be looking at that guy, right? And this attention, you can be focused on this individual. Right afterwards, it's not like they wait. Right afterwards, you give a description, right? Unless you're in a highly emotionally aroused state, you said, with that proviso, assuming you're not. I mean, I think if someone came at me with a knife, I might be highly emotionally aroused. But anyway, assuming this person was somewhat calm, cool, and collected, paid attention, and would have gotten an accurate description. Okay, one more, yeah?
I'd be worried about a language barrier.
Okay.
Because he was originally from Japan. Like, you would know this until you met Mr. Atari, that
Right.
perhaps while giving his description, he might have been with a very limited English vocabulary. Like, might not have been as descriptive as it could have been like if he had somebody who spoke Japanese who could translate it.
Okay, so you would worry. Hopefully the police, if they thought Mr. Hattori's language skills in English was not, he couldn't understand, they would bring in a translator, but we don't know if they did that or not. Actually, some of you guys did an excellent job. I mean, I read all 209 of them. It took me a while. But this is the problem with open-ended questions. But some people actually used, and I think maybe I should give marks, extra bonus marks. Maybe I can't do it now. But, you know, some people actually cited studies. Fisher et al., this study, that study would support this and that. The Lindsay, the Yarmy study, I said, wow, these people really spent, you know, they spent like, oh no, about the whole page, like 50, 60 lines. So I was impressed. But I couldn't give you extra marks, even though I was impressed. But I'll think about it for next term. Weapon focus. The issue of weapon focus, you might find that people focus on the weapon, so these are your responses. The problem would be that the person would focus on the weapon. You already mentioned this, the time delay. This is particularly for case number 2, 4 months. No, you mentioned the language issue, that was mentioned, but the cross-racial problem. So certainly the cross-racial effect, and I'll mention the cross-racial effect. Remember that, okay? Cross-racial effect is important. Contextual factors that was mentioned, dark, poor lighting, it was late, he might have been tired, etc. Use of simultaneous lineups, being that's problematic, especially when the target is not present. Okay, simultaneous lineups will be problematic when the target is not present. Hypnosis. And we don't know, but there's one of you, or a couple of you went on about saying, well, The Ottawa police probably used some leading questions, and then they introduced misinformation, and then they had citations to Loftus. And I thought, okay, well, if that happened, then that's why you're not convinced. Okay, so this, you just had to fill in the blank. So I'm sure everyone can get this perfect now. Are you okay, Charles? Yeah, okay. So, police most often use simultaneous lineups. Simultaneous lineups encourage witness to make relative? Yeah? Is that right? Okay, we've got this. Okay, we've got relative, and he's trying to influence you the other way. Who thinks it's relative? Who thinks it's absolute? A few. Who thinks it's something completely different? Okay, well, okay, I'll come back. I've got the answer. Whereas sequential lineups encourage witness to make absolute. Okay, the answer is relative and absolute. Relative is when you have all the pictures there in front of you, right? Simultaneous, all pictures is the way you can remember. And then you can compare against each other. Sequential, you just see one at a time. Right? You can't do that. Well, I guess you can remember the one you saw before, but sequential encourages absolute judgment. Remember last week I talked about the elimination lineup for children? Uses both simultaneous, it's in sequential for children. So 57% of you got the relative correct when you did the assignment, and 64% got absolute. So now you know the answer. So if it's on Saturday morning, if you see simultaneous and sequential, it shouldn't be a problem. Okay, verdict. 83% said not guilty. Now you didn't have much information. Obviously no one would go to trial with just this one. Well, I say that, but in most cases you don't just go to trial with an eyewitness testimony, one person. Although, as we can see with some of those wrongful convicted cases, that's exactly what happened. Right? People went to trial. All they had, there was no physical evidence, no other circumstantial evidence. All they had was one eyewitness, typically the victim of an assault or rape or whatever. Right? So there are cases where we know this has gone to trial. So most of you said no, we would find the perpetrator not guilty, mainly because we only had eyewitness testimony, there was not enough evidence. Case 2, if you hypnotize someone, that's tainted evidence, is not admissible in Canada. So it was good that people read the book and found that it was not admissible. We're going to talk about what's a reasonable doubt. So the burden of proof for criminal trials is beyond a reasonable doubt. So in your mind, or some of your minds, this was not beyond a reasonable doubt. And then some people said there's not enough hard evidence. And then the hard evidence that they were looking for was things like DNA evidence. I'm not sure what DNA evidence you'd be able to find, but no fingerprint evidence. Right? Someone says, well, they should have found the car that was stolen, dusted the car, then there would be fingerprint evidence, then I'd be more convinced. Those 17% of you who said, yes, I would find the perpetrator guilty, said that, well, this person was certain he had identified the perpetrator. And he had been interviewed right after, and it was a good lineup. Everything worked. He was confident in his identification. Therefore, he should have been found guilty. Okay, so certainly there were some differences there in terms of guilt versus innocent. Okay, we're going to move to characteristics of juries. First thing, well, here in Canada, we want to make sure that when there is a jury trial, and they're relatively rare in Canada, but when there's a jury trial, we want to make sure you're being tried by a jury of one's peers. Okay, that will make it representative. Now, certainly, it will depend on the community that you commit the crime versus the community or the location for which you're being tried. Sometimes they change the location, And it changes the nature of the community in terms of social economic status, in terms of racial distribution. Certainly in the O.J. Simpson case, they moved the location of that trial. Had O.J. been tried around the area for where the murder had taken place, it was predominantly white and high economic status. They moved it to downtown, where the racial economic distribution was quite different. So on that jury for O.J. Simpson, there was 9 black individuals, 1 Hispanic, and 2 Caucasian or white. Okay? And we can come back to that because O.J. Simpson is one of the trials that used jury consultants, and there was sort of a battle with the consultants about which would be better. Anyway, it should be randomly selected from the community. And there's requirements that you need to make. You know, you have to be a certain age, and there's some exemptions. Then you should be impartial. So there's 2 key functions of juries. So if, again, we may ask, what are the 2 important features of juries? 1, that they're representative of the community. 2, that they're impartial. So they should be able to set aside any biases they have, or any prejudice they may have towards certain groups of individuals, maybe certain minorities, so that they're just going to hear the evidence, and based on the evidence, they're going to make a determination of guilt or innocence, or not guilty. Okay? So the role of the juries is, juries are primarily used in criminal cases rather than civil cases in Canada. In the book, it goes through indictable offenses, hybrid offenses, and summary offenses, so there's a good coverage of that in your book. But certainly for the more serious offenses or indictable offenses, you can choose to be tried by a jury. It is mandatory if you're charged with murder that you go and be judged by your peers. If you're charged with a summary offense, a less serious offense, then you don't have a choice. You're going to be tried by a judge. And then there's all the in-between offenses that you can choose. You can decide, and you can consult with your lawyer, should I get tried by 12 individuals or 1? Okay? That'll be your choice, except for certain cases. 37% of criminal trials in Ontario, only in 37% of trials or cases is there a trial. So the vast majority of cases, either, most of them, the individual decides to plead guilty, right? So there's no trial. So, I mean, it's not like every time someone gets charged and the Crown goes forward with the charge that you're going to have a trial. Because most cases, they get resolved pretty quickly. Right? Most of them say, okay, I'll plea bargain it, I'll plead guilty, there'll be a discussion, okay, I'll get 6 months. And we just resolve it that way. So trials don't happen as often as you think, and jury trials even less often. Okay? You know it consists of 12. I think everyone knows about. Now, here in Canada, it consists of 12. Anyone know how many? What's the number in the States? Anyone? Used to be 12. It used to be 12, and then the Supreme Court in the United States in 1907 said that was a historical accident, that there was 12 on the jury. So they moved in 1970 to a 6-member jury. So in many cases, only 6. Everyone must agree. Okay, so even if one of the 12, right, unanimous agreement, every single one, when they go into that jury deliberations, must agree that the person is guilty. Yeah?
Where did that come from historically?
Where did the 12 come historically? I'm guessing, and I have to look this up. So the question is, where did 12 come historically? It's probably from British common law, but I don't know. I don't know. So maybe you could look it up and tell us. Okay, that'll be your job. Certainly in some jurisdiction, only a majority needs to agree. In some countries like Germany, they got rid of jury trials altogether. You would be tried by a judge. They felt that jury trials tend to get it wrong. Right? So they got rid of jury trials altogether in Germany. So it really varies country by country. Okay, so my question, should you get charged with an indictable offense? Not murder, because we know what happened in murder. But if you were going to get charged with, I don't know, aggravated assault. Okay? You got into an altercation with someone in the class here. Okay? And then we caught it on videotape. Charles was there to catch it on videotape, and we all saw it. And then you get charged with aggravated assault. Okay? Would you want to be tried by a judge or a jury? Judge. Who would want to be tried by a judge? Come on, hands up so we see it. Okay, few. And how many would want to be tried by a jury? A few more. And the rest of you would plea bargain out, I guess. Right? You just say, oh, I'm guilty. They caught me on video. Charles is going to testify against me. Okay. There's been this famous study. There's actually not much research on this, but this is sort of the study that you'll find in every single Calvin Zilsol's 1966 study. And this is an actual field study. They went back to look at actual trials. So they asked judges who had sat with the jury, right? So he or she had listened to all the evidence. So had the jurors. They came back with a certain decision. And then this researcher went back saying, well, ignoring what the jury said, what would you have done? Right? You heard all the evidence. Now, of course, you didn't do the deliberations, but you heard all the evidence. What would your verdict had been had you made the decision? So it's kind of interesting study, right? And I don't think there's a single replication of this that I found. Okay, maybe judges don't like disclosing what they would have said. Now that's, who's that? That's Judge Judy. Is his name Judge Judy or something? Yeah. Well, I don't know if I would want to be in front of her. She might be a little harsh. But anyway, so this is what they find. You can see that for hung, it should say hung jury. So hung means that you couldn't make a decision. The jurors could not make the decision. Judges always make the decision. Right? One person, you can make a decision, yes, no. Right? When there's 12, it's a little more difficult for everyone to agree. So that's why there's 0 for trial judge there. But anyway, when you look at acquits versus convicts, those of you who selected trial by jury, you're probably more likely to get off. Right? 30% versus 17%. So these are the same cases, right? 30% of the time the jury acquitted, only 17% in the same cases would the judge acquit. And then it's, of course, opposite for convicts. So judges tend to be much more harsh and more likely to find someone guilty than juries. Okay, so should you ever be, right? You know you're not going to take the polygraph. You know you're wanting a jury trial. Okay, legal function of juries. They are in Canada. You're supposed to simply take note of all the facts. The prosecutor, the Crown, will present their evidence. The defense will present evidence. And you're supposed to sit there and listen to all this information. And then just based on the facts of the case, right, the trial evidence, you're to make a determination of guilty or not guilty. So that's the decision on a verdict. And certainly what happens with a verdict is you may go into the chambers to try before the deliberations with your ideas, but then you're going to be exposed to the rest of 11 other individuals' understanding of the evidence, right? And then there'll be this group discussion, and it may take 1 hour, it may take 3 hours, it may take 4 weeks, it may take 6 weeks, right? If you cannot come to a decision, right, then you're hung. The jury's hung, not, right? Then there's a mistrial, and then the Crown can decide whether they'll go forward on another trial. So the burden of proof at criminal trials is the highest burden. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. And there's huge debates in the legal literature. What does this mean? Reasonable doubt is beyond the reasonable doubt of a reasonable individual, right? So that if you're a reasonable individual, you think that beyond a reasonable doubt, this person is guilty. And they've done studies trying to decide what is this sort of the threshold. Is it 80%? Is it 50%? Is it 70%? And they've not been able to pin down what this threshold is. Okay, one study said it's like 75%, beyond 75% doubt. Other studies says no, it has to be like 90%, beyond 90% doubt, right? So it's very difficult, right, to sort of say what is a reasonable doubt. Sentencing is not a function of Canadian jurors. And certainly in the States, for capital hearing, is a jury decides whether the person gets the death penalty or not. We don't. Juries here in Canada, we do not make that decision. So you say yes, our friend here is guilty of aggravated assault. The jury decides that. But the jury can't say, I think he should get a, 2-year sentence. Right? That is not part of the duties of the jury, except in one limited circumstance. The limited circumstance is that if you're found guilty of second-degree murder, okay, you get a mandatory life sentence, just like you get for first-degree murder. But the jury for second-degree murder can recommend when you should be eligible for parole. The minimum they can recommend is 10 years. The maximum is 25. So in the case of, so that's clear. So a second-degree murder, you come back with guilty. Then you can recommend to the judge, we think this individual should serve 15 years prior to parole eligibility, or 10, or 20, or 22. Certainly in your textbook, there's 2 cases covered in a box called jury nullification. So jury nullification occurs when juries go against legislation. And in that box, it talks about Morgenthaler 4 times. He stood in front of a jury for engaging in illegal abortions. 4 times, despite clear evidence that he committed these abortions, the law indicated when he committed these abortions, it was against the law, against Canadian law. It was very clear-cut, right, that he was guilty. And he admitted that he had done these abortions. And he said, yes, I think the law is wrong, so I'm going to keep doing these abortions. And every single time he went in front of a jury of his peers, every single case, both in Quebec and Ontario, the juries came back and said he's not guilty. And then there was an appeal, right? And every single time when it went to appeal, it was overturned and he was found guilty. So the community was disagreeing with the law, right? And so it's called jury nullification. Happened to some degree also in the Robert Latimer case. This is the father who murdered his 12-year-old daughter. In his mind, he was committing, basically saving her, euthanasia in a sense. She was only 12 years old at the time. She was a very disabled child, had gone through numerous surgeries, was in chronic pain. He could not see her facing any more surgeries. So he put her in his truck. He turned the truck on, put a tube from the back of the exhaust into the window, and she died. He then first said she had died in her sleep. Then he admitted that he killed her. Okay, so he was charged with second-degree murder. He was found guilty of second-degree murder. I mean, it's hard not to say it was some planning involved, right? I mean, he picked her up, put her in the car. He put the hose into the window, turned the truck on, etc. But when the jury came back, right, so this is a second-degree murder. They can make a recommendation in this case, right? Because this is the only time where they can make a recommendation. So when they came back, they said, yes, he's guilty of second-degree murder, and we recommend a 1-year sentence. And the judge says, but you can't. The minimum is 10 years. They say, in this case, because of the nature of the case, we recommend 1 year, and that's what we're going with. So the judge says, fine, okay, I sentence you to 1 year. Well, of course, the Crown appealed this, and under appeal, it was automatically raised to a 10-year sentence. So he had to serve 10 years, not the 1 year being recommended. Okay? Yeah, it's back.
I have a question. How could the judge let him, like, put him in sentence to 1 year if it wasn't allowed to recommend that in the first place?
Why did the judge let them sentence them? Yeah. Well, the judge had told them that during the judge's instructions that you must sentence 10 to 25, and they simply came back, and I guess the judge decided that in this case, I don't know if it's a he or she, but they were going to go with what the jury recommended. So I mean, certainly he was, when the Crown appealed the case, it was determined that he was wrong. He shouldn't have done that. So he got his knuckles rapped, but he thought due to the nature and the circumstances, he was just going to go along with the... It's the same sort of thing that happened in the Morgenthau case, right? He simply accepted the not guilty plea, and then it was appealed. Yeah?
Yeah, I remember that case very well. Actually, when it went back, when he got raised to 10 years, it's actually very political behind that. Because they were talking whether or not euthanasia becomes legal. It was a very, very...
Right. Okay. Yeah. So
they were worried about setting precedents. When does euthanasia become legal?
Right. Okay.
Can I kill my wife because she has cancer?
Right. So you're right. So certainly the Latimer case sparked the whole debate about euthanasia and whether or not we should be able to, provide that for individuals who are chronically ill. Right. And we haven't resolved that debate yet. Yes?
So the judges can disagree with the jury?
Judges can't disagree with juries about the verdict, guilt or not guilt. Judges typically, in all other cases except for second-degree murder, they're the ones that give the sentence. Right? And remember, with the Latimer case, it was just simply that the juries recommend this. A judge can say, I take your recommendation and I will ignore it. In this case, though, it's a very unusual case that the judge agreed to take this 1-year recommendation, even though in the criminal code it clearly said the minimum was 10 years. So he felt that there was the circumstances surrounding this case, the 1 year was justifiable. In all of the other cases other than this, well, the judge gives the sentence. Okay. So in all cases, the judge will give the sentence. In some cases, like first-degree murder, there's no option, right? I mean, if you get convicted of first-degree murder, you're automatically got a life sentence 25 years prior to parole, so there's not much room to, right? That's automatic. But in all of the other, you can look at we'll come back to this when we talk about sentencing. There's amazing sentencing disparity. Actually, we'll come back to this when we're talking about the Gillian Guest case. Because there was 2 convictions of obstruction of justice, and there was quite large differences in the sentence that were received. Okay, another question, yeah? We've got your question. Okay, what you think of it? Yep.
When there's an appeal, is the verdict always changed?
Pardon me?
When there's an appeal, is the verdict always changed?
No. Sometimes it's upheld and sometimes it's overturned. Right? So when there's an appeal, it's not necessarily going to be overturned. It may be upheld. Okay? Do you remember now? You got an answer? Okay. Okay, jury bias. This is not in your textbook, but certainly there's quite a bit of research looking at the different type of biases, or the potential sources of a jury and what's their biases. So this interest prejudice. Okay, so if you've got an interest prejudice, it means that you have a direct interest in the outcome of the case. Okay, so let's say, I don't know, in the case of Robert Latimer, one of his relatives just happened to get picked to go on. I mean, it was quite a small town from where they're from, so just happened to get selected, right? A relative of Latimer. So there would be, you know, certainly there's a direct. You're related to the accused. You're going to have a direct, specific interest, right, in what's the outcome. Okay. So if you're related to accused, that's interest prejudice. If the specific prejudice, and I'm going to make sure I get this right, is that if you have attitudes about a specific case. So, and these attitudes are, let's say, formed by pre-trial media coverage. I don't know, well, should I talk about current cases? Oh, what the heck. The minister, the Catholic bishop, I guess, who just got caught at the Ottawa airport September 15th with child pornography on his laptop. You remember who we're talking about? Okay. Hundreds, I guess, now of images of little young boys doing sexual acts with older men. He's been charged with this. I don't know, and there's lots of pretrial publicity. It's also linked to the horrific abuse suffered by children at homes run by different religious affiliations. So you can see how pretrial media exposure might influence individuals, and they might develop a specific prejudice against that individual. Okay, so that's what specific prejudice is. Generic prejudice is that you have a generic bias or prejudice against a group of individuals, be it a minority group, be it a gender orientation group, be it certain types of offenders, right? Perhaps you know someone who was sexually assaulted, you were sexually assaulted yourself, right? So you have a very hostile attitude towards sex offenders, right? So if you're selected, you might have this generic prejudice against the individual accused. You don't know the individual accused. It's all sex offenders. Okay? It may be all murderers. Right? It's all individuals from a certain background. And then a normative prejudice is where there's a community sentiment against a certain individual. Okay? So I don't know. Let's say there's a you think there's a community. You're living on the west coast on Salt Spring Island, and the logging companies are coming and clear-cutting all the logs, and all the communities around this area are against logging or clear-cut logging, and there's a civil suit against this company. So there's a community, right, normative prejudice against logging companies. Okay? So these are 4 types of prejudices that have been identified that could impact on a jury's decision making. Now, the most famous juror in Canada, and again, she is profiled in your book, and we'll have to move like this. It's the Gillian Guess case. Now, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. This is from an article. That's Gillian Guess. That's from the front page of Saturday Night Magazine. That's her. Those are the red shoes she would wear into the courtroom. I don't know if she wore that red dress into the courtroom, but anyway, she liked wearing those red shoes. She was a juror. This is out in BC. She was a juror in a double murder case. So Peter Gill and 5 others were charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Supposedly this was a drug rivalry. They were one group of individuals wanting to control the drug trade in Vancouver. Another group, Gill and some of his accomplishments went and killed 2 brothers, Desange brothers. Execution style, took them in the back alley, shot them in the head and killed them. So then there was a trial, and Gillian Guest was one of the jurors on that trial. Peter Gill was out on bail during the time of the trial. It was about, I think, about 8 or 9 month trial. Typically, first-degree murder trials take a while, and there's 5 accused, so there's a lot of evidence. Anyway, she started flirting with Peter Gill. So he was about 33 years old, she was about 44 years old. For some reason, they just hooked up. She saw him, he saw her, and they started exchanging glances. He started writing notes down and wanting her to try to get notes to her. Supposedly, he met her in a McDonald's. And anyway, things developed from there. And it developed to such a point where they started having sexual relations. So they started dating each other. And she actually said to him, do you think I should say something to someone? Like, should I tell someone that we're dating? He says, no, don't tell anyone. I mean, that's the last thing you want to do, right? I mean, in his mind, of course, he wants her there because he's hoping that she will help his case, right? Now, I don't know what his initial motivation was to start dating one of the jurors. I mean, I'm pretty sure he was a pretty accomplished and criminal. He had quite a long history. He probably knew that this was definitely inappropriate behavior. I would think that she should have known, although she had no history of antisocial behavior whatsoever, that this was not appropriate behavior. They talked about how you're going to have to be impartial. Well, if you're sleeping with the accused, I don't know. Anyway, the long and the short of it, Peter Gill was charged, and then they were all found not guilty. She went to the jury deliberations, and she voted to say he was not guilty. He was found not guilty. See, I don't know what the split was. We don't know what the split was. It just her saying not guilty, and all 11 saying guilty? Even if it's just one, he would have been found not guilty, right? So she was then the only juror in Canada ever charged with obstruction of justice for this behavior. I guess once the trial was done, the RCMP started wiretapping her house. They started following them around, getting evidence to say that, yes, they had been involved with each other. Even Peter Gill's wife, who was sitting in the courtroom, her name was, this is her name, Gogo. Gogo complained to her husband, that juror's flirting with you. I don't know when he told her, yeah, we're not only flirting, we're having an affair on the side, but I don't know if he told her that. But anyway, the long and short of it, she just said, I've been convicted for falling in love and nothing more. I've not committed a crime. So she fell in love with this guy. That was it. What's interesting, she was charged. And what sentence do you think she received? Okay. I mean, you can read the actual judgment. I think I have it somewhere here, where the judge is scathing, right? I mean, this was sort of like the crime of obstruction of justice at core attack upon fair trials and integrity of the Canadian justice system, right? The judges were outraged by what happened, right? So what sort of sentence do you think Gillian Guest should have gotten? Jail time? Okay. Well, he's saying 2 years. Does that sound about right? Well, you were right. She was given an 18-month sentence. So she was given 18 months in jail for this obstruction of justice. Okay? Peter Gill, they decided not to go forward with retrying him on the murder. So the Crown withdrew the murder charges, put forward an obstruction of justice charges for the same reasons, right? Because he was obstructing the justice. And does anyone know what Peter Gill got for the obstruction of justice? Well, he got longer. He got 6 years. Okay, so he got 3 times longer than Guess for the same offense. And the judge said it was because he was more responsible. He was engaging in this behavior because he was trying to manipulate the outcome of the trial. Gillian Guess was sort of naive, fell in love or whatever. She wasn't trying to manipulate the outcome of the trial, but this Peter Gill was. Right? His choice, I mean, if he came back as guilty, he was going to be facing 2 counts of 25 years minimum. Right? So he was highly motivated to manipulate the system. So he served 6 years for that. Yeah?
Isn't the maximum sentence for obstruction of justice 7 years?
I don't know if the okay, the question is the maximum sentence for obstruction of justice 7 years? I don't know. I'd have to check this. So he almost got the maximum. Okay. Yeah.
Couldn't he have wanted obstruction of justice to get the 6 years rather than 25?
Couldn't he have wanted to do this to get
Get the 6 years rather than have 25?
one? Well, I think that's what his motivation was. Yeah. I mean, who knows? He's not telling what his motivation was, right? He's saying, "Oh yeah, I fell in love with her," right? But I mean, according to the judgment, for the reason for sentencing for Gill, the judge perceived the reason was that he was trying to manipulate the outcome of his first-degree murder trial.
Trying to manipulate having a guilty plea or having him being changed from charges?
Well, I don't know. I mean, he was facing the first-degree murder charges, so he was maybe trying to manipulate to have a not guilty plea at that time, right? I'm guessing, right? And it worked. I mean, he was found not guilty. And the Crown never put forward. So right now, these 2 people were killed. No one has been found responsible for them, right? In this case. Okay, exceptions from jury duty. If you're a legislator, police officer, law, it varies from province to province what the rules are. If you're convicted of a criminal offense and not pardoned, we're not saying you, right? You can avoid jury duty by being convicted of a criminal offense. Certainly it varies, as I say. So if it also, I don't know, you got the amount of money you get paid. I think it's $20 a day, and then it moves up to $40 a day, and then up to $100 a day, depending on how long the trial is. So you do get paid, but pretty minimal, right, for your time that you're spending sitting and not working or not coming to class or whatever. Certainly you also, if you've served on a jury in the last 3 years, you're exempt for a 3-year period. So every 3 years, potentially, you could get a summons saying that you've been selected. And you'd be going down to the court to see whether or not you would be serving on the jury or not. Okay, so we talked about the Gillian Guess case. What to do if jurors are not impartial. So one thing, there's 3 different things that can happen. One, there can be a stay of proceedings. Okay, the trial can be delayed for a time period until the pretrial attention, the amount of interest in the case diminishes. Certainly when you have a large case, a murder case, or what's happened with this child pornography case, those sort of cases, huge amount of media interest. And then something else happens and catches the media's attention, so the amount of attention paid diminishes. Okay, so you do have a stay of proceeding, but this is problematic, because then the victims, right, and the other witnesses may be delayed before they testify. And we already talked about the impact of the delay in testimony or delay in memory if you start extending the delay. So this doesn't happen that often, stay of proceedings. Change of venue, that's what happened in the O.J. Simpson case. It happened in the Bernardo case. Because of the amount of publicity in the Paul Bernardo case in St. Catharines, they decided to move that trial outside of St. Catharines to Toronto. Okay, so you're moving the trial. Typically, this most often happens in a relatively small town city where everyone knows a person, where there's been lots and lots of discussion of this individual. And if you move it into a larger city, you may be able to get a wider representation of individuals to have potential of getting individuals who are impartial. There's been research and there's been a meta-analysis showing the increased pre-trial publicity. And typically, pre-trial publicity is not positive publicity. It's negative publicity towards the accused, is related to increased likelihood of guilty verdicts. So there's been research looking at the impact of pre-trial publicity and guilt. And the answer is yes. The more publicity, the more likely a guilty verdict. So that's why we have this change of venue. The other way you can handle this is what's called challenge for cause. And this is assuming, let's say here in Ottawa, about 1 million people around this area. So it's not assuming, the change of venue means, but we've got everyone in a small town, everyone is potentially biased, are not going to be impartial. But here in Ottawa, there might be pockets of individuals or groups who are impartial, and we just have to find them. Okay, so this would be what happens with challenge for cause. So then there'd be a telephone survey to assess public opinion on a specific case. Okay, certain set of questions would be asked, and then you would get these questions, and then these questions that are developed are going to be posed to you if you show up for jury duty. Okay? So we get pre-selected questions. You're going to then be asked these questions to see whether you have a particular prejudice in the case at hand. So they're going to be very specific to the case. Because we're going to try to find a group of jurors here in Ottawa who have not read all about whatever, whatever the case will be. Okay? This is actually a very unusual procedure. It's only done in Canada. The way it's done is where 2 individuals are randomly selected from the pool. Okay, so all of you showed up for jury duty, and I selected you, and whoever's phone is ringing, I select you. Okay, you're the 2 triers. Okay, now it's done. So you're the 2 triers. Oh, okay. You and you, I think. Over here. Oh, she's trying to hide her head. But anyway, Hurley, this is the 1 trier, 2 trier over there. Anyway, you're the ones that make the decision. It's not the judge. So you're going to go up front, and you're going to be the juror, and these 2 people are going to ask you questions to see if you're biased or not. And you're going to answer the questions, and then these 2 are going to make the decision whether you're biased or not. And they think you're biased, you're kicked out. You're gone. And then they'll go on to the next person, you. They'll ask you questions, and you answer the questions, whatever. They think you're not biased. So you join them, and then you replace one of the triers. I know it's getting complicated. But anyway, the individual juries make the decision, not the judge and not the lawyers. So in the challenge for cause in Bernardo case, there was a change in venue, from St. Catharines to Toronto. They still realized in Toronto, obviously everyone was reading about the Bernardo and Homolka case as well, So they also had challenge for cause. Okay? So 980 people were selected from Toronto. Because they knew they would have to select quite a large sample to try and get some impartial jurors. They think there was 8 questions asked. I'm not going to go through the questions, but they all related to, have you read anything about the Bernardo Homolka case? Do you know anything about the case? Have you obtained any? There was lots of information on the internet, about the case. Have you gone to the internet to look at this information? So those are sort of questions there. Have you signed a petition against Bernardo and Homolka? I mean, if you signed a petition, you might be somewhat biased, prejudiced. As a result of any knowledge, discussion, or contact with any group or organization, have you formed any opinion about the guilt or innocence of the accused Paul Bernardo? So you see, all the challenge for cause questions, these were all pre-tested on a community sample from Toronto first, right? And some people were saying yes. So these are questions that had been pre-formed. Then the juries were selected to ask these questions. Okay, so this took 5 days. And finally, 8 men and 4 women were chosen for the jury, for the Paul Bernardo. And they were selected from this large sample, right, to be unbiased or not prejudiced. Okay, another way that the lawyers, now so far nothing to do with lawyers. Lawyers can have a certain impact on selecting. So peremptory challenges occur where if I'm the lawyer, okay, and I don't know much about you, I know your age, I know what your demeanor, because I can see you, and you're coming into the courtroom, I can't ask you questions about your personality, I can't ask you questions about your background or anything like that, just by what your demeanor. For murder cases, both the prosecution and defense have 20 of these. I'm taking a look at you at the back, and I'm thinking, oh, I don't want you, so I'm going to get rid of you. Well, ask you to leave. Or not invite you to be on. Right? So 20 of these, I can just, for no reason whatsoever. You haven't done anything, you're just showing up, and the judge decides, I don't want younger, well-educated men on this. I just don't want them. For some reason, the lawyer thinks that that would not be the sort of jury, would be in the best interest of their client. So 20 cases for murder and 12 in other cases. There's no reason we can get, ask you to leave. I don't want you on the jury. Okay, are there specific attitudes that will predict juries' verdicts? There's been lots of research trying to find specific attitudes. And the only one that's consistently been found to relate to guilty verdicts. So obviously, if you're a Crown prosecutor, you'll want individuals, okay, well, not obviously, Crown prosecutors should be seeking justice, the right? They shouldn't be stacking the jurors to be in their favor. So let's do it the other way. If you're a defense lawyer, you're arguing the best interest of your client, you would want an individual low on authoritarianism. Right? Because high on authoritarianism, and there's this example, the Revised Legal Attitude Scale. It's a 30-item scale. This is a self-report scale you can give to an individual. They simply answer these items. Too many obviously guilty persons escape punishment because of legal technicalities. Right? Do you believe that? Yes, no. It's on a 3 or 4 point scale. Upstanding citizens have nothing to fear from the police, right? Higher you get on the scale, the more likely you are to come back with a guilty verdict, regardless of the evidence. Okay? So these types of individuals believe that police are doing things right. The police tend to catch the right person, right? But we should hold people accountable for their behavior, right? So simply trying to sway, so if you're a defense, you don't want people like this who score high on the jury. Right? You want to be able to present your evidence that your client is not guilty. So that's the one general attitude that's related to jury verdicts. In the States, this is a huge industry. And it's gotten larger after the Martha Stewart case where there was jury consultants. The O.J. Simpson case, there was jury consultants. Any large, high-profile case, both the Crown or the defense and the prosecution will hire trial consultants. And what trial consultants try to do is for the specific case at hand, it may be it a domestic violence case or domestic violence case with a homicide, Martha Stewart with a fraud case, right? For the specific juror, I mean, you've got an ideal juror that you want to select. And this ideal juror will differ from the prosecution, versus the defense, right? And so what these trial consultants, many of them have a background in criminology or psychology. And you can go on the internet and you'll find hordes of these. Right? These are private companies that you as a lawyer can hire to help you with your case. And they take you right from the beginning right to the end. They will coach your witnesses for you. Right? If you're a defendant in the case, okay, so you're a defendant in the case, you are, right? And you're sitting there, and so the trial consultants say, you know, you're not looking all that upset or sad. The juries are watching you, and they're not getting, I'm watching the juries, I'm sitting in the trial, and you're not acting the way you should act. Maybe you could show a little more emotion. Oh, okay, the next time I go in, I have to remember to bring me some Kleenex, I'll start crying. So they will consult right through, right from the beginning, right through the end. They will also do public opinion polls, right? So O.J. Simpson's, there was a public opinion poll. They'll bring in focus groups. Now they do it all online, right? Online focus groups. What would be the best information to present to you so that you'd find a not guilty outcome in this specific trial? In some cases, I mean, we're talking these, I mean, to have mock trials, can you imagine how much that would cost? It would cost, you know, probably about $100,000. Right? You bring in 12 people. You'll bring in experts that are going to testify. You go through the entire trial. And then you see what manipulation works best to get the verdict that you want. So obviously, if this is a defense case, the defendant's going to have an awful lot of money before they start bringing trial consultants. Right? We're talking in some cases, and I have no idea what the O.J. Simpsons, but I'm guessing we're talking the hundreds of thousands that the trial consultant was making on that one case. Okay, so that's a potential career, right? I think you're going to make $100,000. The O.J. Simpson's case had a supplemental jury questionnaire, took 4 to 7 hours for people to complete. The defense came up, talked to their trial consultant and said, we want these 200 questions or 300 questions or whatever. The Crown says, I also had a trial consultant, we want these questions to be asked. So then they put together 294 questions for these individuals to complete. So you show up, right, you're called for jury duty, you're given this, huge package. And it's not just yes, no answers. Sometimes it's open-ended answers that you have to respond to. Then the lawyers read them over and decide, is that a good person or not? And they talk to the consultant. Okay, here's some examples. You can get this online if you want to see all 294 questions. Some of the questions, I have no idea why the trial consultants came up with them. They're just really bizarre. Now, first of all, the first one is not bizarre at all, right, if you know the case. Have you ever had your spouse or significant other call the police on you for any reason, even if you were not arrested? Right, because there was a history of domestic violence, right, with O.J. and the victim. Then, now it even gets a little strange. Have you ever asked a celebrity for an autograph? Well, maybe they thought O.J. is a celebrity. We want to know how people respond to celebrities. I don't know. I have no idea what this is. Have you ever given a blood sample to your doctor for testing? Well, how many haven't? I don't know. I don't know why they asked that. Are there any charities or organizations to which you make donations? Oh, I don't know. Maybe O.J. made donations to charities, or maybe he ran. I have no idea. You can read through them, and they get really strange. Have you ever had amniocentesis? Would you agree to abort a baby if it was, I mean, all these very strange questions. It's not clear exactly what they're trying to get at, but both sides supposedly had these consultants, and these are the questions they developed. Okay, methods to study. I'll talk about this methods, and I'm going to talk about one study that's in the book that certainly is a well-known study looking at the impact of pretrial information. So we can do post-trial interviews with jurors. In the States you can at any rate. So you will often see after verdicts, the jurors will come out and then they'll have a, can you talk about why you decided that this person should be found guilty or not? Certainly that's a fabulous, interesting, for researchers, that would be very useful to do, right? What key piece of evidence was discussed in the deliberations, right? Because that would help. You can just imagine lawyers would love to have that information, because then that would impact on maybe how they present cases in the future. In Canada, we're forbidden. Although you saw in the videotape last week, we're forbidden unless there's new evidence that was not discussed in the trial, right? So if you can't discuss anything that was in the trial and your deliberations, but you can be asked about, and there was a case that we saw, new evidence. Did you hear about this evidence? Would that have changed your mind? So that's the only circumstance can the Canadian juror make any comment. So we can't do that in Canada. Archival studies, like any of the other type, we can go back to look at the features of guilty versus not guilty verdicts. You can go back and look at archival studies. You can do field studies. Any of you can go down to the Elgin Street Courthouse and sit in on a trial. Right? You can watch it from beginning to end. I don't know, you can code, supposedly, I think this is a myth, if the juries refuse to look at the defendant when they come back from the room, that means they're going to come back with a guilty. Right? But if they look at the defendant, that means it's going to be not guilty. Who knows? We could do a mini study, we could sit there, and we could code, does the jurors look at the defendant when they come back or not? I mean, I'm not sure what use that information would be, but you certainly could do a study to examine that. And then most of the research, like in all areas of psychology, right, lie detection, malingering, we've always talked about simulation studies, so most of the research in the area of jury decision making, and this is actually one of the largest areas of research in forensic psychology is jury decision making, is simulation. And most of the simulation studies use university students. Okay? So I'm going to talk about this one jury simulation study by Crane et al. Is covered very superficially in your textbook. So the purpose of this study was to look at pre-trial information. You were either exposed to, let's say this half the room was showing a videotape information, and this half was written transcript, so you just read the details. Okay, because they want to look at the impact of video, right, visual versus auditory. Most of the research uses written transcripts. The participants in this case were actually both jury-eligible non-students, so community sample, so that's good, and students. Because the simulation studies have been criticized for focusing solely on students. And they had two different types of pre-trial biasing information. Okay? The factual biasing information was that you got information about the individual's prior criminal history. So this was a case where an individual robbed a store, okay, for money, and then drove away, okay, and then got caught, right? Drove off and got caught. So the factual biasing information is that you were told about his previous criminal history. Now that's not admissible in courts in Canada, but they were trying to look about this. This could be disclosed in pre-trial, right, in the media. So-and-so's had a lengthy history of armed robberies. The emotionally biasing was where you were told that this individual, when he drove off, there was a hit and run close to the store from which he robbed, and he hit a 6-year-old child who got killed. Okay? So now in your mind, not only did he rob the store, but he was racing away, killed a child while he was doing his, getting away from the crime. So that's emotionally arousing information, right? Because there's now a child involved and a child was killed. This is one of these psychology studies that was extremely complex. They also manipulated when they gave the biasing information, either 12 days prior to the trial or immediately before. Okay? So either 12 days prior, you had time to think about it right before you're going to make your decision, They also had judges' instructions. So far, this is a 2 by 2 by 2 design. Okay, it's a very complicated design. Okay, judges' instructions to warning you to pay no attention to pretrial publicity. So one way to deal with pretrial publicity is for the judge to say, ignore that information. Right? You see this happening in courts all the time, right? There's inappropriate or inadmissible evidence entered. The judge tells you to ignore that information. Right? So in this case, they're saying the judge warned to ignore pretrial information or not. And this is a fabulous study, because most simulation studies, jury decision-making studies, only look at individual verdicts. Okay? That's not what happens in the real world, right? You don't have individual verdicts, you have group verdicts. So this is a good study because it also looked at deliberation. So you gave your individual verdict what you thought, then you went to the room and you deliberated, just like you do in an actual study. Okay. What they found was for the biasing conditions, remember factually biasing or emotional biasing, no influence on individual verdicts. Okay, now this is good to know because most studies would stop there. Okay, the vast majority, as I say, jury decision-making studies stop there. But if you give biasing information, the biggest impact is when you get together in a group and discuss the case. Okay, and that's maybe not surprising because someone might start talking about the pretrial information. Right? And other people start thinking about it, and then the group process, that is going to have an impact. And now this is important because what we do in the real case is we have group deliberations, right? We don't have individual verdicts. Time delay, reduce the impact of factual information. Remember, there was a 12 days before immediate. That was important for changing the influence of that sort of information. Right? The 12 days below, 12 days prior, less impact, but no influence on the emotional biasing information. So it doesn't matter whether you heard about that little kid being killed by that runaway car 12 days before or immediately before, it had an impact. Judges' instructions. Right? Judges give instructions to ignore pretrial information, ignore information that shouldn't have been heard, had no impact on decision-making whatsoever. Okay? And it's been suggested that in often cases, I have a minute to go, often cases it's because the judges are using language that is simply way too complex. And I'm going to give you an example, and I'll end with this, of a judge's instructions telling a jury what is meant by reasonable doubt. Right? Because that's the burden you must meet to make a decision. So here it is. Reasonable doubt is defined as follows. It's not a mere possible doubt because everything related to human affairs and depending on moral evidence is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. It is a state of case which, after the entire comparison and consideration of all the evidence, leaves the minds of you, the juries, in that condition that you cannot say you feel an abiding conviction to moral certainty of the truth of the plaintiff's case. I don't know what the hell he was talking about. And you can see the jury sitting there listening to this saying, whatever, right? And then going from there. Okay, I'm going to finish talking about juries and do the review on Wednesday. I'm up. You're on. I'm on. Okay. We're on. Okay, guys. We're ready to start. We're going to cover about 10 or 12 slides talking about jury decision making, and then we're going to move into the midterm review. I put this on Monday, so this is where you need to be, hopefully prior to 9 a.m. on Saturday. Okay? So this is, you need to go to Azarelli Theater, and that's your last name, so it tells you where to go. It's a 3-hour exam. I will, because there's I just read the discussion group, and people are still confused about what's covered on the exam. It's from chapters 1 through 6. I'll be doing a review from chapters 1 through 6. Someone on the discussion group says, oh, no, chapter 6 is not on the exam. Chapter 6 is on the exam. So that's also up on WebCT. So you should be able to locate that. So this class, I'm going to talk about predicting jury verdicts. I was going to talk about the CSI effect. I'm going to move that till Monday. So the CSI effect and research looking at whether the CSI effect is true, fact or fiction will be talked about on Monday. I will focus on a couple of slides looking at individual verdicts or what predicts individual verdicts or group verdicts right now. And then I did say you should have come with questions about the midterm. If you don't have questions, I do have summary slides that I can go through. So we'll just play it by ear. We'll see whether you guys have questions. If not, I can go through these summary slides. At the last two slides, I'm not going to go through them, but the last two slides in today's lecture, I give you tips on how to read and ideas for guessing if you should not have the answer. Hopefully you have the answer. But if you absolutely have to guess, I have the last slide talks about the best way to guess. Okay? And you can go look at them. And the slide before that talks about the best way to answer multiple choice exams. Okay, so you can look through those, and hopefully they will help. Okay, so jury simulation studies. I ended last week talking about that Kramer et al. Study, looking at pretrial publicity, factual versus emotionally biasing information. Most of the research in this area, and this actually does apply for the polygraph as well for malingering. So if there's, certainly in the area of malingering and lie detection, most of the research that's being done are simulation studies. So the same problems that apply for those studies also apply for jury decision making. One, that the type of information you get in a jury decision making study is very brief. You can imagine in an actual trial, lots and lots of complex information is provided to you. It may go on for weeks, months, in rare circumstances, years, right? So when we get people to come into a lab and we give them, let's say, a 20-minute or even a half an hour or 1 hour study, in no way does it match the complexity of an actual trial. Okay, so that's a criticism of all this research that have looked at how juries make decisions based on information that doesn't reflect what actually happens in a real trial. So that's one main criticism. Next, if I get you to come into my lab, and then if I get a group of 12 of you to come in, right, you make a decision about some case I present to you, and I could even do a mock trial, right? You're watching the Crown opening statements, defense opening statements, expert testimony, and then I ask you to make a decision. Well, your decision has no impact on the individual defendant, right? So you may not be as engaged in the process, or your decision that you make may not reflect your decision had you been in an actual juror trial. So that's the problem. The majority of research focuses on individual verdicts. That's not true of that was not true of the Kramer et al. Study. But most of the research has focused on individual verdicts. We don't have individual verdicts. We have a group process, group verdicts after deliberation. This is a very extensive, if you add group deliberations, you're adding an extra hour or so onto experiments. So often people want to get the experiments done and off they go. Even if there are group deliberations, remember I said in Canada there's 12 people on the jury? Often the studies that have looked at group deliberations only have had 4 to 6 individuals. So again, it doesn't represent the true fact of 12 individuals sitting in a room making a decision. And finally, the vast majority of research have used university students. Now, there's nothing wrong with university students, but you are more educated. You come from a different, there's not the same ethnic representation as you would find in the community. You're younger than the average juror. Right? So you have more knowledge than the average juror. So we may know a lot about how university students would respond, but we may not know much about how community members would respond. Now, the reason the Cramer et al. Study was so good is it had community-eligible jurors. So it went out and compared students to community-eligible jurors. In the book, it talks about 2 methods of jury decision making, the mathematical method and the explanation method. So the mathematical method is that you would sit there and you would listen to all the evidence. And that every piece of evidence, be it DNA, eyewitness, victim statement, expert witness statement, whatever, you would assign some sort of number, right, in your head. Not consciously. You assign a number saying, oh, that's more important, that's less important. And then when you came to deliberate, you would weight the evidence that you perceived as more or less important. And that may or may not agree with the other people on the jury. Okay, so you may or not, right? And then you somehow come up with some algorithm to make a decision. So this mathematical model, it turns out there's very little empirical support for it. Okay, so there's not strong support for this. Instead, where there's stronger support is what's called the story model that Pennington and Hastie proposed many, many years ago. And the story model is an example of an explanation model. What the story model says is that individuals come to a jury with preconceived beliefs, biases, stereotypes, etc. So they bring all of that experiences to the situation. They listen to the evidence, and they try to create a story, a narrative. Okay? And they may filter out information that they don't think is important or doesn't match their story. So they're sitting in that jury box, listening to information. They might think that an individual is credible or not based on experience or stereotypes, and they might filter out that information saying that doesn't fit into my story of what happened. Okay, so each one of them will have a different story. Okay? So they get this story, then they hear the different verdicts that are available. The judge provides the instructions. Then they're going to classify their decision based on the story that they developed. Now, the story may also influence what happens during deliberations. Because they might be trying to convince other people that their narrative or story is the most accurate depiction of what happened. Okay? So there'll be 12 people with these different stories, all trying to come to some sort of consensus. Pennington's done a number of studies where they've actually videotaped, these are lab studies still, videotape people going through the group deliberation process. Then they code what these individuals talk about, and it turns out there's pretty good evidence that juries follow this sort of explanatory model. Okay, so if I asked you which model has the most empirical support, certainly the story model would be supported. Any questions about those? Okay. I'm going to talk briefly about each of 4 different areas when you're research predicting verdicts in terms of demographics, what personality traits might predict someone's verdict, defendant characteristics, and this time I'm going to just focus on race, and victim characteristics. I'm going to focus on physical attractiveness and sex history. Okay, so those are there's others in the book, but I'm just going to focus on those areas. Okay, so does gender matter? You can see for the O.J. Simpson case, the defense, after doing their jury consultant research, they wanted female African Americans. They thought female African Americans were more tolerant of domestic violence. According to their research, the the telephone surveys, the mock juries that they did, their focus groups, so they were trying to get female African Americans. The other side of the coin, the prosecution jury consultant said, no, we don't. African American females will be very harsh on an African American male, which O.J. Simpson's was. So we want Caucasian females. Okay. So, and we know what the outcome of that trial was. Female jurors tend to be more lenient in general. Okay? They tend to be more lenient in general, except when the trial involves a sexually related crime. So a child sexual abuse case, child molestation, sexual assault. In those cases, okay, female jurors tend to be more harsh. They're more likely to convict than men. And there's research suggesting, well, is it because they have more empathy for the victim? In most cases, it's a male defendant. In most cases, it's a female victim, right? In a sexual assault case, there's not that many male-on-male cases. So that the perception is that females will tend to side with a female victim. She will be more empathetic to that victim. She'll think that victim is more credible, especially in a sexual assault case where it's he says, she says. He says she consented. She says I did not consent. And this is the vast majority of rape cases, right? There's an issue of consent. Often there's no physical evidence. Well, there may be physical evidence of, DNA type evidence. Yes, but the man says, yes, we had sex, right? She says, I didn't consent. He says, well, I thought she consented. Right? So you just, it's back and forth. Who are you going to believe? And female jurors tend to believe the female victim. Right? And male jurors tend to question whether that's a credible statement or not. There's also research suggesting that female lawyers or attorneys are more successful, and successful being that they're more successful in getting guilty verdicts in sexual assault cases. So it is going to be an interaction between the gender of the lawyer and the gender composition of the juror. Okay, the pool that you're looking at. Okay, for personality traits, I already mentioned this personality trait earlier, that there's a moderate positive link between authoritarianism and guilty verdicts. Right? And I talked about the legal attitude questionnaire. There's a questionnaire you can give. It's a 30-item questionnaire to measure this trait or attitude. And those individuals who score high on this are more rigid thinking, more conservative, they're more willing to comply with authority. And in those cases, these individuals, and there's a host of studies, there's about 2 or 3 meta-analyses supporting this, right? That if you score high on this trait, regardless of what information is in the trial, you're just simply more likely to come back with a guilty verdict. Right? So you can see that if you're working for the prosecution, and if you want to stack the jury, you want to get individuals who score high on this. Okay, the next area I'm moving to is looking at race. And this is a study done at, I think it was Harvard that did this study. This psychologist working at Harvard. And this is not my title. This is the title of their paper, Looking Death-Worthy. And what they did this study in Philadelphia. They got all 600 death penalty eligible cases. All 600. Okay, so these are individuals who had been found guilty of capital murder, got their photographs, had individuals rate the photographs, okay, on whether or not the individual in the photograph looked more or less stereotypically black. Okay? And so that was one part of the study. They simply had independent raters rate photographs like this. Okay, black and white, you know. And if I asked you which face up on the screen do you think the raters would have selected as being more, or let's say more stereotypic black, which A or B? B? Yeah. So certainly photo B. And when they were asked what made photo B in your mind, they said, well, he's darker skinned, he had a broader nose, he had thicker lips. That's what they did. And what's interesting, they looked at the inter-rater reliability of this, and it was very high. A different set of students looked at them, and they came up with the same ratings. Okay? So then what they did was they divided their sample into the 44 black defendants who had killed a white victim. Okay, so there's 44 who killed a white victim. Of those 44, they divided them into looking more or less stereotypically black. Okay, so that's one part of the study. Then they got the, I think it was about 300, maybe a little more, 300 cases of black men killing black victims. Okay, so intraracial killing. And again, they coded them in terms of more or less stereotypical black or not. Okay, so it was a 2-by-2 design. White victim, black victim, all black defendants, and then varying on this dimension. We'll come back to this when we talk about homicide. Certainly what happens, and this has been shown time and time again, black men who kill white victims are more likely to get the death penalty. So 41% got the death penalty. Remember, these were just death eligible. They've been convicted of capital murder, and then there's another stage, right? Whether they get the death penalty or not. So 41% of those who killed white victims got the death penalty, and I'll just get the right. And 27% of those black men who killed black victims got the death penalty. So we already know there's a racial bias. If you kill a white person, at least in Philadelphia, if you kill a white victim, you're more likely to get the death penalty than a black victim. Okay? This is the results they found in terms of, okay, having, again, it was a university study, having groups of individuals, right, rate whether or not, based on the case characteristics, right, should the person be given the death penalty or not. Okay? So if you look at the right side, is a black defendant with a white victim. And you can see there is a significant effect for the more stereotypical the person looked in the photograph, right? Darker skin, etc., the more likely there would be a vote for the death penalty. Okay? So it's about 2 times more. Okay? So 24% for less and 58% for more. But, so certainly when you have a black defendant, killing a white, race is very salient. And it does have an impact on jury decision making, at least in this laboratory study. Then they looked at the larger group, right, where it was black on black killings. no effect whatsoever. So it was only in the case where there was a white victim was there an impact. Okay, any questions about this study? Okay, so they concluded that certainly our findings suggest that in cases involving a black defendant and a white victim, cases in which the likelihood of death penalty is already high. Okay, we already know this, right? There is a bias there. Jurors are influenced not simply by the knowledge that the defendant is black, right? They will know that information, but also by the extent which the defendant appears stereotypically black. So this should not obviously play a role, right, in decision making. What you look like and how much or how more or less you look like some stereotype should not have an impact on the outcome of whether someone receives a death penalty. And certainly this study is suggesting it does, and it has a dramatic impact. Yeah?
Did they do the reverse test?
They do the reverse test where a white defendant.
For the white person?
Right, white. I have not seen that. Because the answer is, the question is, have they done a test where they looked at white on white, white versus black? And this group of researchers have not. And I haven't seen that in the literature. So what would you predict?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
And in addition, you're looking at a sample size of 44 versus 300.
Right, but to be fair to these researchers, right, his comment was you're looking at sample sizes 44 to 300. But, I mean, they actually taking actual cases. So that's what's so good about this study. They're actually taking death penalty cases, right, to do the research. You might say they might be better to maybe go nationally rather than looking only in their city, I mean, if they could. And then you could have, I mean, the point is that there's more black people killing black victims. It is representing the actual scenario of what's happening out there in the real world. Okay, any other questions? Okay, we're going to move to what is beautiful is good. This is from a title from a paper done in 1970, where basically this research had nothing to do with forensic psychologists in 1970 or for forensic issues. They were simply saying they did research looking at the more attractive you are, right? The better job you get, the higher salary you get, the more happy you are in your marriage, etc., etc., etc. So just physical attractiveness is related to success in society. Okay, so that's where that quote comes, what is beautiful is good. Other researchers since then have then looked at whether or not how attractive a defendant is. Okay, so someone who's on trial, is that going to be related to verdicts? And Dr. Sandy Taylor has just published a study in the United Kingdom, and this is a quote from her study, saying, attractive defendants are, it seems, rated less harshly than what she used, homely defendants, so perhaps justice isn't blind after all. Okay, so this is where you're looking at how attractive an individual is, and then seeing if it's related to verdicts. There's been a number of studies, and the answer is yes. The less attractive individual, regardless, and they've actually controlled for, right, when they do these studies, everything else is identical. The crime is identical, right, you're given a vignette. Everything is the same. The only thing that differs is the photo at the end of this scenario. Right? Everything about all the evidence is identical, and this half the room gets the attractive photo, this half the room gets the less attractive person. And what happens is, this half the room, you say, oh, that's a good-looking person. She couldn't have done that. We shouldn't be, she's really good-looking. Well, see, they don't say this. I mean, obviously they don't say that, but they're less likely to come back with a guilty verdict. And even if they did come back with a guilty verdict, they think the more attractive person should spend less time in jail. She doesn't need to spend time in jail, and it's the opposite, right? You guys who saw the plain-looking photo, even though everything was the same, you think that that person's more guilty. and should spend longer. So this study here, neither that death-worthy study or this study, these are recent studies, so they're not in your textbook. So this study by Patry, 2008, not in your textbook, he looked at females. Most of the research looked at male defendants, right? And then they coded attractive or not attractive, and it doesn't matter the gender of the defendant. The more attractive you are, the less likely you'll get a guilty verdict. So this may be why you see these trial consultants spiffing up, telling their defendants to clean up, right? Put a suit on, cut your hair, look tight, don't make any outbursts, right? Because the more attractive you are, the more likely the jurors are either to believe you or question that you couldn't possibly have done it. So if you just look at the individual verdicts, and so what's interesting about this study is they had, again, separate from other studies, they had individual verdicts versus group verdicts. So this is a finding that gets replicated time and time again. This is a woman committing an armed robbery, so it's a female defendant. She has a distinct tattoo on her hand that the eyewitness talked about. The defendant claimed that she was at a motel 75 miles away, so she couldn't be robbing this retail store. Supposedly went to the retail store with a gun and robbed this retail store. Then there's 3 pages of case summary information, and then you either get an attractive photo or not so attractive photo at the end, and this is the effect. Right? The attractive individual, 52% voted for guilt. And then if you just manipulate the slide, it jumps to 77%. Okay? So, and that's where most people have stopped. The vast majority of research, remember I said in these jury simulations, have stopped there. They only look at individual verdicts. And what's neat about this study, then they did the group verdict. Right? So they had these individuals come together and decide. And what happened was, when they had the group process, and this is, I don't know if this is going to replicate or not. This is the only study out there that looked at female defendants and group verdicts and looking at effect. It was the opposite effect. Okay, so this is an interaction you're seeing up there. It was the more attractive individual, right, who were more likely to be found guilty than the less attractive. So something happened in the group process, right, that switched the verdicts. Now, it is very common that when you're looking at individual versus group verdicts, individually you say guilty, but once you hear everyone else talk, right, and they raise questions about the evidence, then your decision, oh, I think that person is guilty, is less likely. Okay, so that finding, right, that there's lower rates of guilt for group verdicts is common. But it's unusual that it flips around. Okay, you got? Okay, so I have one more slide and then we'll move to the review. And this is looking at victim characteristics. Okay, so I've been talking about defendant characteristics, right? Race and attractiveness. And I'm just going to, again, there's lots of research on different types of victim characteristics. I'm just going to focus on the sexual history of a rape victim. So should a rape victim's sexual history be kept secret? Certainly here in Canada it is, well, since 1985, and then the Rape Shield Law was modified, and it even made it more stringent in 1992. Okay? But in many other countries, victims who are taking the stand, right? And in a sexual assault case, victims will take the stand to say what happened. Their sexual history is open to cross-examination. Okay, so they can be asked all about their sexual history, how many times they've had sex, what sort of sex they like, don't they like to be tied up, etc., etc. Don't they like a little bit of violence, that sort of thing? So often, women who have been sexually assaulted, they don't want to be on the stand. I mean, cross-examine in a public courtroom about this issue. So certainly in Canada, we've stopped. And there's research showing that if you talk about the sexual history of the victim, how promiscuous she is, perhaps if she's a sex trade worker, right? that sort of thing, it does have an impact on jury decision making, and they're seen as less credible victims, the questioned. Right? If you're promiscuous, you drink alcohol, and you go to the guy's house, and now you're claiming you didn't consent to have sex, right? When you've done that before, that will be related to the jurors finding the individual defendant not guilty. Okay? And certainly, as I indicated, in the vast majority of cases here in Canada, we do have the Rape Shield law. So information about the victim's sexual history will not be admitted most of the times, unless it's related to the credibility of what the victim is saying, and the judge, on a case-by-case basis, then can admit that evidence. Okay? But you can go to most countries in the world, this is not the case. And certainly, it's been found that after the trial, the victim often will say, I have been re-victimized again by that defense attorney. I should have never come forward. It would have been better for me not to have gone through this process. Right? And then, then it sort of caps with, let's say, if the person is found not guilty, and it all surrounds the fact, well, you must be promiscuous. Right? You engage in casual sexual behavior. Right? It has nothing to do with the actual event. Okay, you guys just want the review. I'm going to... Okay, never mind. Okay, so that's it about jury decision making. We have about, what, about an hour or so to talk about, a little less than an hour. Okay, so what do you want to know about the midterm? What's on it? Yeah, I knew that. Yes. Okay, you first. Nice and loud, but I'll repeat.
How much the case study would be on the...
Okay, the question is how many are the case studies? So you will need to read those boxes. Okay, so when it has sometimes there's a box that describes a key case example relevant to legislation. Yes, you need to know that case. Pardon me? What about the cases? Okay, what about the cases within the text? Well, if it's again, if it relates to some significant event, yes. How's that? Yes, that is a good answer. Okay, yeah.
How similar in difficulty will the questions be on the midterm as compared to that small group of multiple choice questions that we did earlier?
They're taken from the identical test bank, so they should be very similar. Okay, so the question is how similar are the questions on the midterm to the quiz that you did? They were those 30 quiz items. I know you've got 20 of those, right? But those 30 quiz items were taken from the identical test bank that I'm using for the midterm. Okay, anyone up? Okay, you and then you.
Yeah, the history of forensics.
History of forensics.
I can't remember the first story.
Okay, who's the founder of forensic psychology?
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. Okay, someone here. Okay, this is not good. The father of forensic psychology. Say it out. You're right. Yes. Munstenberg. You need to know Munstenberg's name. Well, not so much the dates, but he's the founder. No, you don't need to know the dates. But well, there was a question on there, but I took it out from that table, right? That big table that had, yeah. They said they had a question that had to put them in order. I said, who cares? So I took it out. I had it in there, but I said, I'll take it out. Okay. Yep.
So I'm guessing that the questions are similar to quiz, so they're similar to the study guide.
The question is, if the midterm questions are similar to the quizzes, they're going to be similar to what's in the study guide. Yes. That's true. There's lots of overlap. If you study, I predict you do very well. Remember, those who wrote the quiz, 40% of you got in the A range. I know it was open book, but if you've gone through all the quizzes here in the study guide, and you've looked in detail's good. You've studied really hard, and you've looked at which studies overlap when I present them and is in the text. Those are the particular ones you need to focus on. Okay? Do you want me to go through the slides I have, or do you want to keep asking questions? You want to ask questions? Okay. How many multiple choice questions? There's 70 multiple choice. Okay, any other? Yeah? Yes, each chapter is weighted similarly. We developed, I think there was 3 questions directly from Natalie, the profiling, and Ian's lecture on the polygraph. But again, some of their materials certainly overlap with the chapters. Okay? Any other questions? Do you want me to go? I've got some sample multiple choice too. Do you want to do that? Okay. So what is forensic psychology? You need to know the difference between the narrow and broad, right? Narrow, just clinical forensic, right? Expert testimony. So you need to know about the roles of clinical forensic. There'll be definitely a question on the different roles, what a clinical forensic psychologist does versus experimental. The broad definition includes everything, right? I'm a forensic psychologist. I'm not a clinical forensic psychologist, but I do research. Yeah?
Yeah, I get confused between psychology in the law, psychology of the law, and psychology.
Right, so you do need to focus on the psychology in the law, right? That is part of the law, psychology and the law, the differences between that okay, so psychology in the law, you're doing, right? Right, and so you will need to know the difference between psychology in the law, right, is what effect does it have, and the law research that I'm doing, and psychology of the law, okay, the policy type research. So go back to my slides. I think I did it. I agree it's a little confusing. And then the other thing that relates to that is the psychology and law distinctions on page 25, I'm thinking. No, I don't know what page is on. Anyway, there's a whole page where they list the different dimensions, how psychology and law differ, right? Methodology, principles, latitude. Does that ring a bell? Okay. So you will need to, actually, I think I put down the page somewhere. Page 20, what I said 25, page 21. So there's 7 dimensions where law and psychology vary. So there is definitely a question relating to those 7 dimensions. That's my hint. I don't know about that, the other question you're asking. William Stern, it was on the quiz. Remember William Stern? He was the one that there was a law professor where he came in and there was an argument. Someone pulled out a revolver. I know this is going back 6 weeks ago, but anyway. He came in, there was a conflict, right? And then he looked at, right, people's eyewitness recall. And then there was Julian Verndonk. Now, the reason why I have these particular historical figures and names, these are particularly the ones you need to make sure you know, okay? Because I know there's a lot of historical figures, so I'm giving you hints here that you need to know what Julian Verndonk did. And I won't tell you, you can go back and check. Okay, we've got to move forward. Psychological theories of crime. They talked about social learning theories in chapter 1. Hans Eysenck was the first person who developed a testable theory of crime. He's a very famous British psychologist. Okay? Neuroticism, extroversion, psychoticism. Does that ring a bell? Okay, well, read about Hans Eysenck. Then it ended that chapter with talking about psychological experts in the court. Okay, so, and it had a lot about the Frye standard, right? What standard is needed for admissibility of experts in the court. So certainly that was the Frye versus United States. That was about the polygraph, right? Whether or not it should be admissible in the court. 1923 was that study. And then I talked in class about the Regina versus Mohan case, right? And the 4 criteria related to what's needed for admissibility in Canadian courts. Okay? So that, I know, I mean, I'm not doing it justice. I mean, it's impossible, right? So that was what was more or less in chapter 1. Okay, are you ready for your first multiple choice? Any questions? Oh, this was too easy. I gave the answer. Okay, okay, what's the answer? What? Say it out loud. Oh dear, we got C. Munzenberg was a founder for, no. You guys. C. Ising, Hans Ising. I just said Hans Ising developed the first testable. Okay, well anyway, okay, page 9 and 16, it talks a lot about Hans Ising. Okay, let's try the next one. I know you're going to get this one right. So check with don't check on Saturday with the person beside you, but you can check now with the person beside you. So what's the answer? C as in cat. Right? It's a reality experiment, right? They're coming in. Okay? I talked about William Stern study. It's page 9 of the textbook. Okay. Okay, let's keep going. Police selection was chapter 2. Well, it's more than police selection. It was police discretion and police stress, right? Those were the main topics. So job analysis, how to validate an instrument, right? How, when you go to select an individual as a potential recruit, what to look for. So validation is important. How you would validate is described in a box in that chapter. Remember I said you pay attention to the boxes. I viewed the different types of selection instruments, interviews, right? And the problem with interviews is low inter-rater reliability. Psychological tests that describe the MMPI and the Inwald personality inventory specifically designed to predict police performance. That's the only scale out there designed by a police officer and a psychologist to predict. And then there's those situational tests. Right? You put yourself in a situation, domestic violence situation, and then they watch to see how you perform in an actual situation. Okay, does that all? That's fine? Is that? Okay, and then we talked about police discretion. Now, I didn't talk about police discretion. I talked about 2 areas of police discretion in class, but there's 4 areas covered in the textbook. So police discretion about youth, right? How they handle youth, right? Not all youth are necessarily going to be arrested. The different alternate sanctions that the police officer can decide. I did talk about mentally disordered, Linda Teplin's research about how you, and it was on the quiz too, right? Oh, I guess if you got that one question, how police interact with a mentally disordered individual, and what sort of sanctions are most common, and the answer is informal sanctions. I did not talk about domestic disputes, but certainly this is a big area where there's a potential for police discretion, whether you arrest the individuals or whether you deal with them in a different manner. And then we certainly did talk about use of force, right? Discretion, use of force. Remember we talked about Jakanski's case. And for use of force, now this is another hint, use of force is very rare. Now certainly when police officers use force, often it gets in the media, right? When they use lethal force, it gets in the media. But the vast majority of confrontations between individuals and police officers, there's no need for force, right? I mean, many of you may have been stopped by the police, let's say for a traffic violation. You didn't escalate it up to where the taser or handgun was being, well, hopefully you didn't, right? So use of force is relatively rare. Then we talked about police stress, different types of police stress, right? Organizational, within the organization, versus occupational. Occupational being the actual policing job. The fact that they need to go to scenes of car accidents, remember children who are injured, seeing someone killed, that sort of thing. All of that is the occupational side, versus the organizational side is the shift work, the lack of promotion, the lack of support from the boss. Okay, does that? Okay. Okay, also on the exam, and when you see not, most, or true, or false, make sure you read the question really carefully. I mean, that should be obvious. But the easiest way is you should read the question, cover up the alternatives, and try to answer the question without looking at the answers. Is the tip I have at the end. Anyway, which psychometric property are we most concerned with in police selection? Are we most concerned with? C? Right? B? Do we have B? Okay, so when we select a police officer, we want to make sure these individuals will do well in the future, right? They'll perform well as police officers. So the most, we're concerned with a lot of these, but again, it's the most. There's often going to be more than, there's going to be two alternatives that are close, but there's what is the most correct. So the correct answer is C, predictive validity. And I'm going to be putting this up on WebCT after class. So, I mean, you'll have all of these answers. Okay. A police officer witnessed a fellow officer being killed in the line of duty. This is an example of a or an. B as in Bob. Correct. Occupational stressor. For sure, there's going to be a question that relates to giving you an example and asking you whether it's an organizational or occupational stressor. Okay, we're almost halfway through Chapter 3. We talked about police interrogations, the goal of police interrogations, right? The Reed model, and that's, again, covered in somewhat detail in your book. I talked about minimize, maximize techniques. So if there's a question about minimization techniques versus maximization techniques, you can expect a question there. We spend a lot of time talking about false confessions, right? Voluntary. Someone's just going to go to the police station and volunteer with no coercion that they committed a crime, versus coerced compliant. Versus, right, there's something that's happening in the interrogation, you're promised leniency or you're threatened, right? After 10, 15, 20 hours, you just want to get out of the situation. You know you're innocent, but you want to get out of that situation. So it's coerced compliant, right? You're complying with the situation. Versus coerced internalized, I gave you the example of Paul Ingram, right, who actually turned out to start believing that he had sexually assaulted his children. Right? It was internalized. He became to believe, even though he was innocent, he never did it, he began to believe it. So which of those three are most common type of false confession? Yeah? No, not many people voluntarily go and falsely confess to a crime. Well, we hear about them when they happen. Remember, I talked about Jean-Benet Ramsey, that Martin Kerr, he was in Thailand, right? That was an example. But the vast majority of individuals do not, and we talked about their attention seeking if they do, you're right. But that's not the most common type of false confession. Pardon me? Coerced compliant is the most common. Okay, so internalized is very, very rare. Right, that someone actually come to believe. Remember I talked about the Michael Crow case? Right? right? And the Marty Tanko case, all of those were, and the Central Five, right, the teenagers, all of those were coerced, compliant confessions. Okay, then there's the measures. I didn't spend a lot of time on. Gudjonsson suggestibility scale and compliance scale is described in the textbook. So these are two measures to look at interrogation. And I did spend quite a bit of time talking about this Kazan et al., Kazan and Kitchell study. And I said there was a newer study that was done at SFU, Simon Fraser. Right, this is where they brought students in, and they were typing away, and they made the error. And it looked at whether they took responsibility for the error. Oh, I have a hint here. Hint. Remember I said you obey, this relates to your question, I think. Okay, there is one case that slipped in that I think is really kind of unfair. So, in Chapter 3, there's a historical case that relates to interrogation. That you'll need to know that name of that case, and it relates to use of physical force where people were whipped, strapped, like whipped, to get a confession. So that was in the beginning of the chapter. It was talking about the history of interrogations, how we used to use force, physical force, and there's one case mentioned. Okay. Okay, then we talked this, and then Natalie came in and gave that talk on offender profiling. Right, the goals of offender profiling, right, to try to limit the number of suspects out there. Yep.
How well do we need to know the cases by just the author's names? Like, do we need to know the Kazan Kitchell study as like a prompt in the question, or will there be more information in order to associate that with what actually happened in the study?
Excellent question. So how do I have to remember that this Saul Kazan did this particular study on, right, on this laboratory study? There will always be, there will be the name of the authors, and then there'll be some context, right? Right, the study to look at false confessions, or the study to look at interrogation. So there'll be a context provided. So other than sometimes the cases you'll need to know, but for the actual studies there'll always be a context. Okay, so goals of offender profiling, how it's done. Right, in the textbook, and Natalie talked about inductive. Right? You profile an offender from what is known about other offenders. Inductive. Remember, inductive is profiling from other offenders. Right? You have a homicide. You have a serial homicide. You know that most serial killers are white male. So then you predict that the person who committed this specific homicide is a white male. Right? Because that's what the base rate provides you with. Versus deductive, where you're looking at evidence relating to that offender. Right? There might be some signature. They always use a particular knot when they strangle someone. Right? So that would be deductive. She also had the 4 criticisms of profiling. The lack of theory. Right, that they rely on classic trait theory, that people have stable personality traits that they bring to all circumstances and they don't change. That certainly has been questioned. The ambiguous nature of profiling, right, is so general, anyone can do it. And then she called that the Barnum effect. The third question, and this is not in the order that she gave them, the fact that professional profilers do not do all that well as compared to others. And there's one more, and I don't remember it. Oh, I know, I remember it. It relates to the organized, disorganized types that the FBI developed, so you should know what, characteristics of the organized, disorganized types. But she criticized this typology, saying that often offenders engage in some aspects of both types, of being organized and disorganized. So it's a problem for classification. So she spent quite a bit of time going over those 4 problems with offender profiling. What else? And then she talked about geographical profiling. She didn't spend a lot of time on geographical profiling. Certainly there was a circle model, right? The circle model, if you sexually assaulted someone here and way out here, and there's other sexual assault all over here, you draw a circle from the two furthest away, and you assume that the person's home, the perpetrator, would be in the middle of that circle. That's it. That's the circle hypothesis. And then there was a distance decay where it looks like this. So that this is close to the home. You're more likely to commit offenses close to the home rather than further afield. Okay? So certainly she talked about those two models of geographical profiling. Kim Rossmo is profiled in that chapter. So you might want to, again, when there's someone profiled in the chapter, Ogloff, Liu, Rossmo in this chapter, you should know at least what type of research they're doing. And I didn't talk about at all, but the chapter ended, or I guess Natalie didn't talk at all, about racial profiling, about how black men are more likely to be stopped, right, even though they're not engaging in any criminal activity whatsoever. Okay, so the police forces do tend to engage in what we call racial profiling. Oh, that should say chapter 3. I'm sorry, that heading's wrong. It's chapter 3 continued. Okay, any questions about the profiling chapter, interrogations? Okay, well, okay, here's, well, this might be hard. Sorry, yeah. So we've got C's and we've got D's. So again, if you start seeing the same word repeated, that you can try to cross out wrong answers. Okay? Now when you think of confessions, right, you do think of maybe about coercion, or you may think about suggestibility for sure. We talked a lot about suggestibility. So there's, so that leaves it down to, at least if you're going to guess, right? You're going to guess and you get 50%, right? Rather than 20% guessing across all 5. So the correct answer is D, suggestibility and compliance. Okay? So there's separate scales described in that chapter, looking at suggestibility and compliance. 2 separate scales and research associated with them. Okay. Which of the following is not a characteristic of a disorganized offender? So if you get confused by negatives, right, so just say what is, and then the one that stands out is what's not. Okay, that might be easier. So this is a disorganized offender. What's the answer? A. Correct. So you like that one? Okay. Chapter 4, polygraph. So this is Ian's lecture about what a polygraph, do you know what a polygraph measures? Remember? Oh, you'll remember for sure, right? You got all hooked up. So remember what a polygraph measures, the actual physiological measurements. Types of tests. He described 3 different types of tests in here, and they're described in the book. Okay. The validity. He sort of glossed over this, Ian, but there's lots of research looking at the validity of the polygraph, the different types of the guilty knowledge test versus the control question test. Those are the 2 primary types of tests that are being used, and they have different error rates associated with them. Okay, is that deception? So I talked about vocal and non-vocal cues. Now, Heather, the TA, had a review session yesterday morning, and she said something that disagreed with what I said in class. So in your study guide on page 40, when it's talking about non-vocal cues, I said in class that there was no consistent, reliable non-vocal cue. Right? Remember, gaze aversion, all of that stuff? In your study guide, it says non-vocal gestures. Now, it's just we're looking at body movements that appear to indicate deception or reduced hand, arm, feet, or leg movement. That was certainly true in 1998, and it's cited from that 1998 study. The more recent meta-analysis that I was talking about in class, because again, remember this textbook is about 3 years old now, the more recent meta-analysis finds no consistent, reliable, non-vocal cue. Okay, so go by what I say. I'm just telling you. I don't even think there is a question about, oops. But anyway, I don't think there's a question about non-vocal cues, but there is a discrepancy there. So move on. Okay, professionals' ability to detect deception, there is definitely a question about this. Okay, whether profilers, remember there's one study that described, and there was the actual table there describing the accuracy of different types of, and Natalie did talk about it in the class. Yep. You don't need to know the percentages, no, but you need to know the general finding. Okay. Is that okay? Do we want to go back to that, or you? Okay, deception in children. Remember I talked about little liars and the different studies, the gifts, the undesirable gift study, and the reverse rouge test. White lies, pro-social lies. And then we talked about malingering mental disorder. And that in the textbook describes 3 models of malingering. Pathogenic, that someone's mentally disordered, and that's why they malinger. Criminalogenic, they're antisocial criminals, and they're just trying to get away with. You can think of Kenneth Bianchi as that example. They're antisocial individuals. Or adaptational, right? They're trying to adapt to the situation. And if you're in that situation, you might try to malinger to avoid such a severe penalty. Okay, so there's these different models that you need to be familiar with of malingering. Types of studies, field studies, simulation studies, known group design studies, I talked about in class. I talked about the features of malingered psychosis. So certainly in the lecture I talked about what would be a symptom, right, of malingered psychosis. They're more likely to talk about positive symptoms, hallucinations, delusions. They're eager to discuss the symptoms, right? All of those features, and there's a table in your book describing them. I did not talk about in class malingered amnesia, but that's another big area, right? Someone will pretend they have a memory deficit, particularly in a personal injury case, right? You hit your head and you're trying to get some sort of personal compensation. Okay. Do you have a question? Which of the following has not been found effective as a countermeasure to beat the polygraph test? Certainly Ian talked about this, and it's certainly in your textbook as well. So what is not effective? Okay, so some of these are, right? And this is another hint. If you're not sure of an answer, often, if you go through the whole exam, there might be another question relating to countermeasures that will actually provide you with the answer on the exam, not here. So what? D? D as in dog? Dog. Well, of course I'd pick D. Okay, anti-anxiety drugs. Remember, someone asked them over in this side of the room, what about taking Valium? And he said it doesn't matter because they're comparing within the person, right? The control versus relevant question. So anti-anxiety drugs will not be an effective countermeasure. Okay, which of the following statements is true regarding the detection of deception? Now, read them carefully. I'm hearing D again, am I? B. I'm hearing B.
B as in end of the list.
E as in end. Okay, I get it. E as in end. Okay, when you every time you see all of the above, if there's 2 correct answers, then you're pretty much guaranteed, right? It's going to be E, right? So it is E. Right? I talked about high stake versus low stake lies. Right? That they're better at there's a truth bias. So even for B and C are pretty clear the right answer. Okay. We got 2 more chapters. Are we okay with this? Okay. Chapter 5. This should be your memory for chapter 5 and 6 should be better because it's closer in time. Remember memory processing, encoding, storage, recall, or retrieval. The difference between recall and recognition. Remember that crime scene? You had a recall versus recognize. Right? Recall was asked you a question, did you recall something versus recognize, right? You had like a lineup in front of you, you'd have to recognize the individual. The difference between system and estimated variables, right? Estimated variables you have no control over, system variables you do. You have to estimate the effect. I spent time talking about Liz Loftus's research on misinformation effect. So that you give some information that's wrong, right? And people incorporate that information in their memory. We talked about interviewing witnesses. The problem with hypnosis. The steps in a cognitive interview. I did not talk about an enhanced cognitive interview, but it is compared and contrasted in your textbook. And there's research looking at the enhanced cognitive interview, and standard police interview that you should know the differences between and which is most accurate. In chapter 5, it talked about recovered memories. But I didn't talk about recovered memories in that chapter. I talked about it when I talked about child victims and witnesses. So it fit in better, I thought, there, but still it's covered. So recovered memories are in chapter 5, my lecture on October 14th. We spent quite a bit of time talking about lineup identification, right? The difference between target present, target absent, and what is more or less accurate you'll need to know. The difference between, I think you've got this one, simultaneous versus sequential. Right, we covered that on Monday with the assignment 3. Also in the textbook it talks about show-ups and walk-bys. So you need to know the 4 different types of lineup identifications. I did not talk at all in class about voice identification, but it is covered in your textbook. And the different estimated variables, right? That young age, more errors, cross-race effect, we talked about also again on Monday, and weapon focus. So each of those areas were talked about in chapter 5. Okay, so which of the following would be considered an estimator variable in eyewitness research? Estimator. No one, yeah? A, thank you. A, right? You can't control how light it was at the time of the crime, right? You can control how many witnesses are being interviewed. You can control the number of police officers present. You can control the time of day. You can control what type of lineup you give, but you can't control, right, the light at the time. So it would be A. Okay, what increases the likelihood that innocent suspects may be wrongfully identified in a lineup? Now remember, if there's more than 2 correct, Yeah, I'm giving you the answer. Right. The answer is E. Right? All of those are true. So the correct answer would be E. Okay, accuracy of child witnesses. Right? I said children are more suggestible. Right? It's easier to mislead them. If you use free recall, they're just as accurate, but they give less details. Okay? We talked about interviewing techniques with children. The problem with using those dolls, right? The anatomically detailed dolls. There's 14 different companies selling these dolls out there. They vary from like little like Cabbage Patch dolls to sort of like more like Barbie, like, or to little baby, like, you know, little baby type dolls. I talked about CBCA. This is Undeutsches development of this content-related coding, right? So the child discloses information about child being sexually abused. You take the narrative, the content of what the child says, and you apply those 19 criteria to what they say. I described a lab study by Max Steller looking at the accuracy of CBCA in lab research. It's also described in your textbook, and there's a table describing the outcome of that study by Steller. There's also field research that's described in your text. There was a stepwise interview, right? The rapport, the need to go back and assess cognitive verbal ability. You go back and ask them to describe an event. The need to be not usually leading questions about something. You don't say, did something bad happen? Did your uncle do something bad? I talked about the stepwise interview. Describing the culprit. In the text, it talks about what adults focus on versus children focus on and how they differ. Right? And kids tend to focus on the exterior features, like the hair, what it looks like from the exterior, rather than the internal features of a face. Okay? So certainly distinct from adults. We talked about how Joanna Pizzullo and Rod Lindsay developed the elimination lineup that has both relative and absolute judgment for children, is more accurate, right, than the simultaneous lineup as a stand-alone. Now, these last two areas I did not talk about in class. Testifying in court, right, the competency inquiry to see if the child's competent to give testimony. You will need to know what the standards are in Canada, what sort of questions are asked in Canada about competency to take the stand. There's also ways that you can minimize the impact of a child testifying, right? So through closed circuit TV, so they don't have to be the child sitting there and the perpetrator's right in front of the child, and the child being cross-examined right in front of this person, right? Extremely stressful. And there's research that's done in London looking at the stress relating to kids who have to testify, and then they've developed different alternatives to try and minimize the stress, and that we can use. In the textbook, it ends with talking about child abuse, the different types of child abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, exposure to domestic violence. Neglect is the most common type of abuse experienced by Canadian children. It talks about risk factors relating to child and families. It talks about consequences, both short-term and long-term, of child abuse. And finally, it also has a short section on custody issues, right? And that joint custody is the most common. Okay, so in this study, I definitely remember talking about Sam Stone, right? Litchman's and Sissy's Sam Stone study. Remember that clumsy fellow that came into the preschool? Which condition led to the highest accuracy level? You don't? Okay. So which condition? Remember there was a control condition where Sam just came and walked around? The stereotype, Sam was clumsy. The stereotype and suggestion, he was clumsy, and remember that he spilled chocolate on the white teddy bear and he ripped the page out of the book? So which condition were the children most accurate in? Not the one they made the most errors. So what conditions were they most accurate? That they were not susceptible to this misleading information? Oh, come on, guys, quick. A. You're going to do well. A is good. That's the right answer. It's a control condition. You haven't got that figure burned in your eyes? Okay, well, I remember it. And that's so that's. I like Sam Stone. Okay? Okay, this is not covered in the, I didn't cover it in my lecture. Several alternatives to child in custody testimony have been identified. Which alternative is not permissible in the Canadian court system? I hear a B as in Bob. Do I hear another? Everyone wants to go with B. No? What? D? D as in dog? E as in eagle? Oh, you guys. Okay, closed circuit. Yes, for sure, right? You know closed circuit. Hearsay witnesses, yes? Hearsay witnesses, the child discloses to someone else. Typically that's hearsay, but children are you're allowed to include that for child witnesses. Presence of a support person, yes, they can have someone sitting there to help them go through this. Closing the court to public, yes, that's available. No, absolutely not. You can't ban cross-examination. The defense lawyers would go ballistic, right? Of course you need to be able to cross-examine a victim. So the answer is E. Okay? Okay, so good luck on the exam. And one more. You need to, it's clear, some of you may need to study really, really hard. So if you study this hard, I got one more photo to show you. I'm convinced you'll get an A. So do that. Study, 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 and I'm sure you do well. Okay, we'll see you on Saturday.